Good morning. Thank you for joining me today to discuss strategies for aggression and self-injury. My name is Joey Mazzacane. I am a behavior analyst at Autism Learning Partners in Southern California in our Inland Empire region. And I'm so happy to be here with you this morning discussing aggression and self-injury. Our objectives for today are going to be to discuss language and compassion when addressing these behaviors and discussing how that really builds our perspective of them, understanding the functions of the behaviors and how to incorporate that while supporting the reduction of them, and also reviewing how to select strategies that support the individual during these behaviors. We want to create alignment and safety, right, as we're navigating this situation with our friends. So very important that we create the right perspective. Caregivers are often asked to discuss their child's behavior by the clinical team and other people, right? And we begin to form a very clinical perspective towards the behavior and the child. This can lead to disconnect between the child and the caregiver because the child may feel misunderstood or wrong for engaging in these maladaptive behaviors. So we want to foster more alignment between them. And how we're going to do that is with compassion and language. So a good way to combat that disconnect between the behavior and the individual is going to be using language that connects them again. And being careful about the way that we discuss the behavior, right? So behavior is not good or bad inherently. It is a matter of, does the behavior work in accessing the desired result across as many settings as possible? Changing the way that we discuss the behavior can help the individual build a better understanding of their own behavior and the way that others perceive it. So some examples here, right? Some clinical language that you guys may have been exposed to is things like challenging behavior, right? And we want to think about the perspective that builds, right? Challenging behavior is something that you are countering against, right? Challenging is like oppositional. And so we want to think about it in less clinical terms, right? Think about it as maladaptive, like it doesn't always work in getting them access to the things that they want access to. Also clinical language, right, is severe, right? We may ask, how intense was that tantrum? And parents will say things like severe or mild, right? And the compassionate way to talk about that is it required extensive support. It required minimal support. Another one is nonverbal, right? We get that one a lot where people will ask how verbal your child is, and the answers that we get are either nonverbal or verbal, right? And there's a lot more in between those two spectrums than those two answers. So talking about it as, non-vocal communication, right? They are communicating, right? Especially with aggression and self-injury, that is communicating something. And we want to respect that communication, and we just want to shape it to being a more appropriate topography that's going to make them be able to be more autonomous in the community and access more environments. I want to talk about the impact of this, right? The individual develops their relationship with their behavior based on their experience and the way others around them react to it. If we discuss a behavior as bad or challenging, it can create a sense of disconnect for the individual. Including all perspectives is important, but particularly including the perspective of the individual, right? Your child, and how that makes them feel, and how they may be feeling when they engage in those behaviors. Let's get into a little bit more about understanding it, right? So behavior itself isn't good or bad, right? It simply just is what is happening. Behavior is essentially anything that an individual does that interacts with the environment, right? As you guys have been exposed to various levels of intervention and support for your child, you've probably heard behavior discussed a lot with a lot of different definitions. So just to clarify, throughout this presentation, when we're talking about behavior, we're talking about any action that the person is doing, any interaction that they have with their environment. That doesn't necessarily have to be verbal, doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It's essentially anything that a dead person can't do. I'm going to dive into some examples here. So some examples: behavior is blinking, crying, writing, asking for an item, Some things that are not behavior, laying down, ignoring, non-compliance, right? Dead people, super non-compliant. They don't do anything you ask them to do. Same thing with depression and anxiety. Those are not behaviors. There may be behaviors that express symptoms related to those other disorders, but they are not behaviors themselves, right? There is no depression behavior. That's not a certain thing. So those are some examples there, right? And when I say blinking and crying are behaviors, they are measurable things, right? They may have different definitions based on the person. Some people may cry without tears. Some people may cry with tears. Some people may blink, consider a blink with one eye versus a blink with both eyes, right? There can be variation in those, but there are behavior because it's a physical change in the environment. Speaking of environments, before we move on to discussing any kind of strategies, I want to always start us out by looking at potential biological or environmental factors that may be impacting the situation. For example, if there was a medication change recently, or the family moved into a new home, these may manifest differently for everyone, and any environmental changes may, no matter how unrelated they seem, may impact the behavior. Right? So if you move to a new house and your child starts pulling their hair, those two things may seem super unrelated, but they may actually be related depending on the antecedents to the hair pulling and things like that, which we're going to discuss here as we keep going. But just something important to remember, right? Medication changes, right? Doctors will often tell you like certain things to look for. There may be other things that change or shift as you start a new medication or as you wean off of an existing medication that aren't like typical symptoms, but may be related in some way to the change. Okay, now we're going to talk about our 4 functions of behavior. So all ABA-based interventions are determined, like what intervention we're going to use relies pretty heavily on the function of the behavior. So why the behavior is occurring tells us how we should address it. Right? We want to address why the individual is engaging in the behavior so that we can meet their needs while keeping them safe and building their autonomy. Aggression and self-injury are unsafe, potentially dangerous ways to access items or escape tasks or whatever the function is, right? And so we want to change the way that those behaviors look so that they can interact in other environments, right? Like you can't tantrum at the DMV or you get kicked out of the DMV, but you still might want to escape the DMV, and we need to give you other ways of doing that besides tantruming. Okay, so the 4 functions that we're going to utilize to discuss this are listed here, and we use the little acronym SEAT, S-E-A-T, to remember them. And what those each stand for, we're going to talk through here. So S is for sensory, right? This can be motor sensory input. This can be vocal sensory input. It can be auditory sensory input. Comes in a lot of different forms, but the purpose of the behavior is to access some sort of feeling within the body. For escape, this is, escaping a task, escaping a demand, wanting to leave a situation, wanting something to be removed from the situation. Then we have A for attention, right? And attention can come in lots of forms too. I feel like this is the #1 function that gets confused, because attention isn't always, oh, I want you to look at me, or, oh, I want you to talk to me. Sometimes it's body language. Sometimes it's verbal attention. Sometimes it's eye contact. Sometimes it's negative attention, right? Like reprimands or them seeking any various type of attention. I have had clients before where like your body posture is a form of attention that they seek. So if you are engaged in the conversation, they want that. And as soon as you disengage, then they want that attention back, and they will resort to maladaptive behaviors to get that attention again if necessary, right? Last function here is tangibles or access to items, right? So there's an item, a person, or an activity that they're seeking. So we are going to look at aggression and self-injury today as, topographies that get us access to one of these 4 things. could also be 2 or more of these 4 things. But we're gonna talk about them as the function of them as one of these 4 or multiple of them. Talking a little bit more about this functional approach, right? When we're identifying the function of behavior, this has been controversial recently, specifically with the self-advocacy movement coming from autistic individuals. This controversy pretty much is that the 4 functions are oversimplifications of human emotions, right? Or human behavior, and that there's many reasons that people may do things. And I agree with that statement, right? But these 4 functions are kind of buckets or categories that those functions can fit into, right? Particularly, right, talking about not wanting to oversimplify the person's feelings. It doesn't change anything about the fact that you're aggressive if you do it for sensory reasons or if you do it for attention, other than the fact that it's going to change the way I respond to that or my consequence for that. Remember that the individual may be experiencing big emotions during these behaviors. And when I say big emotions, right, even the way that you think of big emotions might be different than the way that they perceive those emotions, right? When you or I are stuck in traffic, we may have very different feelings. I call those big feelings of road rage. And those might not be as big for you or might feel different to you. And that's okay, right? But we want to make sure that we're supporting them through those emotions. The reason to identify the function is so that we can limit the safety concerns and build their autonomy, right? Aggression doesn't work in some situations to get what you want, right? Like I said, the DMV example, being aggressive at school, right, with a peer might not make them engage in the desired consequence, right? If you're engaging in aggression to get someone's attention, and it's an 8-year-old on a playground, they might run away from you instead of providing you with attention if you're aggressive. So that's going to limit your ability to interact in that environment. That's why we want to work on reducing it and changing that topography to something else. Same thing with self-injury, right? Self-injury is extremely dangerous to the individual, or can be extremely dangerous to the individual. And we want to make sure that we're limiting that potential danger and giving them an alternative way to communicate their need. Connecting that function to our support, right? The function itself is not good or bad either, right? Just like the behavior. We just need to meet it in a more functional way. So let's go through an example here. A 14-year-old female engages in headbanging. The team needs to understand the function or the reinforcer that she is getting from engaging in the behavior so that we can support her in accessing the same thing with a less dangerous behavior. Let's say that we notice that she headbangs when she wants to leave an area or situation. We would target her accessing that leave, so asking to leave or telling us that she's going to leave instead of headbanging, which would decrease the self-injury, right? Limiting safety risk, and increase her autonomy in other situations because she could just ask for a break instead of headbanging and then the person having to figure out that that means she wants to leave, right? Some questions for thought here. What happens right before she headbangs? Does she want something? What does the headbanging result in? And what does the headbanging feel like? Right? Those are just some questions as we move on to our next section here and how we're going to talk about antecedents and consequences. Some quick safety considerations. Aggression and self-injury can escalate to life-threatening intensities. Consult with a BCBA or medical support if behavior is reaching these levels. This presentation today is not going to be all the answers you need for aggression and self-injury. There may be instances of aggression and self-injury where the strategies that we discussed today don't work or are not going to be the most effective. Absolutely defer to your personal medical team, your BCBA, before engaging in any of these strategies. This is just some general recommendations and tools for you to use. So we talked about the importance of understanding the behavior from a functional perspective, right? Now we want to talk about how we determine that function so that we can use it to support the individual. We determine the function of engaging in these behaviors using this 3-term contingency. So we look at all behavior as an antecedent, a consequence, and a behavior, right? So A, B, C, antecedent, behavior happens, and then what happens right after. We're going to talk about each of these more here. So to start with antecedents, right? What happens before the behavior? What happens right before? This often helps us demonstrate the function of the behavior. So for example, if immediately before the individual engages in aggression, his brother said no, that may be an indicator that the function is escape or access, because the no immediately preceded the aggression. Watching what happens immediately before the behavior so that you can support the team in developing a good understanding of the function is a great way that you can support your team. Also a great way to have a better understanding of precursors or things that may escalate the individual to further behavior, right? If you know that whenever eggs are discussed, the individual is likely to engage in aggression, then you let your team know that. You can discuss how you're going to navigate those kind of situations where eggs may be brought up, right? Like breakfast time. Some ways to identify the antecedents. So the first thing is identify where the individual is, like observe their environment, right? Obviously, most of the time, right, they're maybe at home or they're out in the community at like a restaurant or something, but look at where their body is in space. Is there people close to them? Are people far away? Is there a couch nearby? Are they standing for a long period? Have they had something fall next to them or onto them? Where they are in space in detail, I guess is a good way of saying that. Step 2 would be observe the environment, right? Was there certain sounds, certain smells, certain color palettes, certain weather changes that occurred right before the behavior happened? A really good example of this, right, again, is like for us, right? If we're walking on the street and all of a sudden there's those first couple drops of rain, that's an antecedent to everybody opening up their umbrella on the street, right? Similar thing here. Antecedents are the easiest part of the environment to change because it happens before the potentially dangerous thing. So this is where we really want to maximize our support, is before the behavior occurs, so that we don't have to worry about safety risks and things like that like we will with consequences. Some 2 general antecedent strategies that I'm going to give you here as supports, right? Priming. And basically what priming is letting the individual know what is coming next or when certain things are going to occur. So back to my eggs example, if we have a friend that is absolutely afraid or does not like eggs, we can let them know, hey, we're going to go to Denny's this morning, and there may be some things there that we don't like. Can you think of what, some things would be that you may see at a breakfast place that you might not want to see? And they could maybe give you some examples, and you guys could talk about how they can navigate that before they're in that situation, right? Where that big emotion happens and it's hard to react the right way. This could look different based on the individual, right? Based on their age and their skill set. It could be anything from a picture board. It could be Google Calendar reminders. I have so many friends now that use their phone and it just has like their schedule in there. So if they're feeling anxious or nervous about what's going to be coming up next, or they don't know what's happening, they can reference that themselves, build some really great autonomy for them, and also still gives them that support that they need. Right. I've also had clients that will text family members and ask, hey, when are we doing this? What is happening with this? Right. All of our friends that are afraid of the dentist. I have a couple of friends where if we bring up the dentist, then he will text mom and say, when am I going to the dentist? She'll text him a date. We'll put it on his calendar. We'll look at how far out that is. We'll talk about the things we can do to make sure that we're ready to go to the dentist, brushing our teeth, flossing, using our mouthwash. Right. And we set reminders for that in our Google Calendar as well. Very cool. That's priming, right? So letting them know what's going to happen before it happens and when those certain things will occur. And like I said, that could look very different depending on the age, the skill set of the individual, but wanting to give them some way of knowing what's going to happen, right? The other one here is shaping. And this one is a little bit different, right? So reinforcing the individual attempting to meet their needs in any other way than the behavior that we were talking about, right? That aggression or that self-injury or whatever. If the client engages in aggression for access to the iPad and they scream iPad one day right before they're starting to get up to maybe be aggressive, provide them with the iPad, even though it wasn't a beautiful, hey mom, can I have the iPad, please? Because reinforcing that scream instead of the aggression may make it so that instead of aggressing, we start with screaming, and then we can gradually shape that scream into a more appropriate request, right? The thing I like to say with shaping is it's kind of meeting us where we're at. Right. So if we're at the point where we are so desperate to escape a situation that we have to be aggressive to escape, if you do anything other than be aggressive to escape, I'm going to accept that. If it's screaming in my face, if it's, getting up and walking away just without being aggressive, right? That's a step towards the right direction. And we can work with any step that way. And I want to support that. So making sure that even if it's not the most beautiful demand in the whole world that they place, meeting them where they're at and gradually making that expectation rise as their skills continue to increase. Now we're going to talk about consequences, right? So we talked about antecedents. That's what happens before the behavior. Consequences are what happens right after the behavior. So an example of this would be the person is aggressive and dad yells, "No, stop it," and runs into the room. Everyone else goes upstairs and closes all the doors. The individual then lays on the couch and falls asleep. What were the consequences in that example? Dad yelling, "No, stop it," right? Dad entering the room, everyone else leaving the room and shutting all the doors. That's a lot of consequences, right? That's a lot of environmental change for the individual being aggressive, right? And then we know that what they did after those consequences were administered was lay down on the couch and fall asleep. So observe those events that happen immediately after the behavior. What do you say? What do your other children say? What happens in the environment, right? And how does your child react to that change in the environment? Ideally, we want to prevent the behavior with antecedents, right? But some things cannot be avoided. So we support the individual through that behavior. First priority always when we're talking about consequences is going to be safety. Just going to remind you of that one more time. I, as a clinician, right, don't care if you reinforce the heck out of an aggressive instance one time to prevent them from engaging in an unsafe behavior or from hurting themselves or someone else. We will address it the next time when we can be more prepared at hopefully at the antecedent level, but if not, with more support in the consequences. But safety is always first, right? Because I can't undo some harm that happens if I'm not maintaining that safety throughout. So a couple of consequence strategies I want to give you, just general strategies, right? There's 3 of them here. The first one is remain calm. And I know this is the hard one and everybody tells you and they don't tell you how to do this. I'm going to make this really as black and white as possible here. Basically, try not to react as much as possible. And what I mean by that is don't not do anything. That's not what I'm saying either, right? Because that would be me telling you not to engage in behavior. And that's not what I'm here to do. But minimize that reaction. Keep a calm demeanor. Help them know that you're there and that you're going to help them, right? Your child, this individual that you're supporting, may be experiencing extreme crisis at this moment, right? Even if it doesn't make sense or is an emotion that you relate to in that moment, they may be feeling something really out of control, and that can be super scary, right? So your reaction may help them feel more calm. It may signal to them that they're safe, that they can communicate in a different way, right? So just keeping that demeanor, and that's going to look different for everybody, right? Some people, right after they engage in aggression, are ready to talk right away. Some people are not, right? I had a client that engaged in some pretty intensive aggression, and the first response that parent engaged in was asking, "What do you need?" And I found that actually further upset the client because they couldn't communicate what they needed at that moment because they had exasperated themselves trying to do it before that. And that last question of asking it just pushed them over the edge, and they couldn't communicate what they wanted in any other way than the aggression that they were engaging in. And that's okay, right? And nobody was doing anything wrong, right? Mom was trying to help him out, but just understanding that it's maybe not the most helpful thing that we can say in that moment. Maybe the most helpful thing we can do is just be there and let them calm a little bit and then communicate in a different way, right? Ensuring safety is also on here. Make sure that they're in a safe location if possible. If items can be removed from the area, great. If they can be led into a safe space, awesome. If not, utilize whatever is available to ensure safety as much as possible while keeping yourself safe. I always get asked about this in the community, like what do I do in the community, right? And that's really drastically going to depend, right, based on the function and what the topography looks like. But if you're in the middle of a target and you cannot safely exit that target without potentially exposing others to risk, you're going to have whatever behavior that is, wherever you are in that target. That's not anybody's favorite thing to do. We get it, right? But we also want to make sure that everybody stays safe. So if you are on an aisle that's not a good spot to be, go towards the end of the aisle, right? Go into a corner of the store if you need to. Feel free to move things, right? Move them, guide them with the least contact possible, move things out of that environment, right? This is particularly something in the home that I feel like we miss a lot. Is client will be like, let's say in the kitchen, and they will start engaging in aggression. And we're concerned about them having access to the stove and sharp items and all that sort of stuff. If we can, let's get out of the kitchen. If we can't get out of the kitchen, let's take those other things out of where we are and just stay where we're at. Right. And that's going to really depend, like I said, on the function of the behavior and based on what it looks like. Right. But making sure that we keep that safety first up in our mind. So remain calm, ensure their safety. The last thing I'm going to give you as a note here is limiting new stimuli. And again, right, my example of the mom asking a question there is her introducing a new stimuli. Now I'm supposed to respond to that. And I'm already having all these big emotions about this other thing I was trying to respond to, right? And so I can't process that new information yet. So limiting the amount of noise in the environment, and I don't mean like noise like sounds, right? But just things happening in the environment. If you can, sometimes it can be helpful to close the blinds, turn down the TV volume, limit other people talking near them, limit the number of people around them if possible. Provide reassurance by remaining near and calm, and whatever other ways that you can in that moment, right? Depending on what it looks like. Just being there can absolutely be reassurance. And there can be other ways of appropriately, providing that reassurance. Some friends love a good, it's all right, we're here, it's okay, right? Have a couple clients that do the okay sign. Whatever works, but just limiting new stimuli or harsh stimuli in that time and allowing them to really de-escalate before we introduce anything new. Okay. So some key things I want you to take away from today. Every behavior serves a purpose, regardless of what it looks like. We may not like that behavior serves a purpose, and we might not like the way that behavior looks, but no matter what, every behavior serves a purpose. The things that occur before and after a behavior can support you in understanding why it's happening and how best to support. Thinking of those antecedents and consequences, right? A couple of general tools that can be supportive, including both antecedents, like priming, and consequences, like remaining calm and limiting new stimuli. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I do have several references here for future reading for you, looking at some of the key articles in behavior analysis and also some newer works that we're that are coming out related to these things. These will all be available for you. These are all research-based articles published in Applied Behavior Analysis. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. And I hope that you learned something that you can take home with you. Have a great day. And thank you so much again.